There is an amplifier sitting on a workbench at a university audio engineering program in the United States right now. It was manufactured in 1962. The students gathered around it are not studying it as a historical artifact. They are studying it because their professor told them it remains the most instructive example of correct output stage design in the American literature, and that 60 years of subsequent engineering has not produced a consensus on how to improve it. The company that made it no longer makes amplifiers. The factory that built it is gone. The men who wound its output transformers by hand to a proprietary specification that was never published are gone. The name on the faceplate now belongs to a Samsung subsidiary that sells Bluetooth speakers. The amplifier still works. In 1959, you could order it through a mail-order catalog out of Chicago for $269.95 in kit form, roughly 3 weeks' wages for an American factory worker. A cardboard box would arrive at your door. You would spend 3 weekends building it on your kitchen table, following a schematic that treated you as a peer. But the real story of the Citation II is not that it survived. It is the story of why American engineers built something so completely correct that the industry walked away from it anyway, and what that decision cost. If this is your first time here, this channel tells the stories of the American instruments and audio equipment that defined a sound, and what happened to the companies that built them. Subscribe if that's the kind of history you want more of. Now, back to Plainview, New York, 1953. Sidney Harman was not a musician. He was not a cabinet maker, or a radio repairman, or a man who had grown up pulling apart his father's Victrola on a Sunday afternoon. He was an electrical engineer with a salesman's instinct and a competitive streak that the American hi-fi industry of the early 1950s had not yet learned to take seriously. He had spent his early career at the David Bogan Company, a New York audio equipment manufacturer that supplied amplifiers to public address systems, school auditoriums, and the lower tier of the home hi-fi market. It was competent work. It was not ambitious work. Harman understood the difference, and by 1953 he had decided to do something about it. He founded Harman Kardon that year in New York City in partnership with Bernard Kardon, whose background was in sales and business development rather than engineering. The partnership would not last long. Kardon departed early. Harman ran the company thereafter, and the direction it took reflected his priorities: engineering first, marketing second, cost reduction a distant third. What Harman saw in 1953 that his competitors had not fully addressed was a specific and underserved American consumer. Not the casual listener who wanted background music in the living room. Not the professional broadcaster who needed reliability above all else. The man Harman was building for was something rarer and more demanding: the engineer audiophile. The American who wanted to understand what he was buying, who read the schematics the way other men read the sports page, who would pay a premium for correctness but would not pay a premium for a name alone. In 1953, that man had limited options. Fisher Radio was producing assembled units of genuine quality out of New York, but at prices that placed them beyond the reach of anyone who wasn't already prosperous, and inside a chassis that offered no visibility into the circuit. H. Scott was doing serious engineering work out of Cambridge, Massachusetts. Marantz was beginning to build a reputation for sonic refinement. These were real companies making real equipment, but they were all selling finished products to passive consumers. The buyer wrote the check and took what came in the box. Heathkit offered a different proposition entirely: the kit, the self-build, the satisfaction of assembly. But Heathkit's engineering, while honest, was not exceptional. The company served the budget end of the market, and it showed. Harman saw the gap between those two positions and decided to occupy it. A kit engineered to a professional standard. A circuit the buyer could study, modify, and fully understand. Documentation that treated the consumer as a peer rather than a customer, and a price that reflected the engineering rather than apologizing for it. To build that product, he needed a specific kind of manufacturing infrastructure, and he found it on Long Island, Plainview, New York sits roughly 30 miles east of Manhattan, in the middle of Nassau County, in the heart of what had become by the early 1950s one of the most concentrated electronics manufacturing corridors in the United States. Grumman Aircraft was in Bethpage, 8 miles away, building the F-9F Panther and later the F-11 Tiger for the United States Navy. Hazeltine Corporation was doing defense electronics research in Little Neck. Sperry was in Lake Success. The corridor was dense with trained machinists, precision fabricators, transformer winders, and chassis manufacturers. Men who had come up through defense contracts and wartime production, and who brought a tolerant standard to civilian work that most consumer electronics manufacturers in other parts of the country could not match. Harman Kardon moved its manufacturing operations to Plainview. The decision was not incidental. The workforce that Long Island offered, technically rigorous, precision-trained, available for civilian production in the post-war expansion, was precisely what a company building to an engineering standard rather than a price point required. The early Harman Kardon models, produced through the mid-1950s, established the company's reputation without yet defining it. Then, in 1958, Harman Kardon introduced the Festival, a product the company marketed as the first integrated stereo receiver offered by an American manufacturer. The claim requires careful handling. Competing accounts exist. But the Festival's significance was real regardless of the priority question. It demonstrated that Harman Kardon was moving faster than its competitors toward the stereo era, and it gave the company a national platform it had not previously possessed. The Citation series followed in 1959. The Citation II was the centerpiece, the stereo power amplifier that the entire line was built around. It produced 60 watts per channel. It used KT88 output tubes, a British design manufactured by GEC and Marconi that was technically superior to the American 6L6 in specific measurable respects, and that Harman Kardon's engineers had selected on those merits rather than for reasons of domestic availability or cost. The output stage employed ultra-linear topology, a circuit configuration that would require a full explanation, and we'll get one. And the entire amplifier was wired point-to-point, by hand, without a printed circuit board in sight. In kit form, it sold for $269.95 through Allied Radio in Chicago and Lafayette Radio Electronics in New York, two of the dominant mail-order electronics catalog houses of the post-war American market, the channels through which a man in Iowa or Montana or suburban Ohio could access equipment that his local hardware store had never heard of. $269.95 in 1959. Roughly 3 weeks' wages for an American factory worker. More than the cost of a Fender Stratocaster the same year. Considerably more than a Dynaco ST70 kit, which could be had for $49.95 and which occupied the Democratic end of the same technical conversation. The men who built the Citation II at Plainview were not assembling a consumer appliance. They were winding output transformers to a proprietary specification that Harman Kardon had developed internally and did not publish. They were fitting point-to-point wiring harnesses. With the tolerance discipline of the defense contracts that had trained them, they were building something designed to outlast the decade, possibly several decades, and they built it accordingly. One of those men, his name is not in the record, had spent the previous 5 years winding transformer assemblies for a defense electronics subcontractor in Nassau County. His hands knew the difference between a winding that met specification and one that merely passed inspection. He applied that knowledge to an audio output transformer in a civilian product that would sell through a mail-order catalog to a man he would never meet, in a living room he would never see, producing a sound he would never hear in the context it was designed for. That transformer is still working today, in amplifiers that have outlasted the company, the factory, the catalog houses, and the man who wound them. The Citation II was announced. The audiophile press took notice, and the American hi-fi market, in the autumn of 1959, had not yet been introduced to the forces that would eventually make everything Harman Kardon had just built feel like a very expensive, very correct, very American argument that nobody intended to win. Walk into Harvey Electronics on West 45th Street in Manhattan in the autumn of 1960, and you would find the Citation II on a shelf between a Fisher 80AZ and a Scott 299. All three were serious American amplifiers. All three were built by companies that understood what they were doing. But the Citation II looked different from the moment you picked up its documentation. The schematic was not a warranty disclaimer. It was an invitation. Harman Kardon printed the full circuit diagram, the component tolerances, the alignment procedure, and the design rationale in the documentation that shipped with every unit, kit, or assembled. The implicit message was direct. We built this correctly, and we are confident enough in that correctness to show you exactly how we did it. In 1960, in the American hi-fi market, that confidence was not common. The amplifier itself was a rectangular steel chassis, conservatively finished, with none of the decorative chrome that Fisher and Marantz used to justify their price points to consumers who judged equipment the way they judged automobiles. The Citation II did not look expensive, it looked precise. Those are different things. And the distinction was intentional. Across the top of the chassis sat 8 KT88 output tubes, 4 per channel, arranged in matched pairs. The KT88 was a British tube manufactured by GEC and Marconi in England, a beam-power tetrode that had been developed for audio amplification, and that produced a specific output characteristic distinct from the American 6LX that Fender and most domestic amplifier designers relied on. The 6L6 was an excellent tube. The KT88 was a different answer to a different question. Higher power handling, a different distortion signature at the onset of clipping, a headroom characteristic that suited the Citation II's design goals more precisely than any American equivalent. Choosing a British tube for a flagship American product was an engineering decision, not a marketing one. It created a supply chain dependency that would matter later. In 1960, it simply meant that the amplifier measured and sounded the way its designers intended. The output stage employed ultra-linear topology. The term requires a definition, and the definition requires a small piece of history. In October 1951, 2 American engineers, David Hafler and Herbert Karowis, published a paper in Audio Engineering magazine, describing a circuit configuration in which the screen grids of the output tubes were connected not to the power supply directly, as in conventional pentode designs, but to taps on the output transformer itself. The effect was a form of distributed feedback. The transformer's behavior influenced the tube's operating point in real time, reducing distortion without the heavy global negative feedback that most designers use to correct for the imperfections of conventional pentode operation. Heavy global negative feedback, wrapping a large corrective signal from the output back to the input to suppress distortion, was the standard American engineering solution of the period. It worked. It also introduced its own artifacts, a particular kind of transient hardness, a tendency toward instability at the frequency extremes, a quality that some listeners described as mechanical, and others simply found fatiguing without being able to name why. Ultralinear operation reduced the distortion before it occurred rather than correcting it afterward. The result was an amplifier that measured well by the standards of the period, and that sounded, to the ears of people who listened carefully, like less of an amplifier, like something that was doing less to the signal rather than more. Dinaco, the Philadelphia kit amplifier company, had used the Hafler-Karros topology in its ST70, introduced in 1959 at $49.95 in kit form. The ST70 would go on to become the most produced tube amplifier in American history. It was an honest, well-engineered product at a democratic price, and it put the ultra-linear principle into more American living rooms than any other single design. The Citation II was not the ST70. It occupied a different position in the same theoretical conversation, a position defined by what Harman Kardon's engineers did with the topology, rather than simply adopting it. The specific implementation in the Citation II used a deliberately low figure of global negative feedback, lower than most competitors considered prudent, lower than the feedback levels that produced the flattest measured frequency response on a test bench. The rationale was precise. Higher feedback levels produced better measurements and worse sound. The engineers at Plainview had decided to optimize for the second criterion rather than the first, at a moment when the American hi-fi industry was still largely organized around measurements as the primary arbiter of quality. The output transformer was custom wound to a proprietary specification. In a tube amplifier, the output transformer is not a passive component. It is an active participant in the circuit's behavior. Its core material, winding geometry, interwinding capacitance, and leakage inductance all interact with the output tubes and the speaker load in ways that affect the amplifier's measured and audible performance at every frequency. A transformer wound to a generic specification produces generic results. The transformer in the Citation II was wound to the specific requirements of the circuit it served, and that specification was never published. The Citation II also offered a feature that distinguished it from nearly every competing American amplifier of the period: a front panel switch that allowed the user to select between ultra-linear pentode operation at the full 60 watts per channel in triode mode, in which the screen grids were connected directly to the plates, reducing output to approximately 30 watts per channel and changing the distortion character entirely. Triode operation produced lower power and a different, many listeners said more musical, and more quality of distortion at the onset of clipping. The switch gave the owner two amplifiers in one chassis, operating from two distinct points on the same theoretical map. At $269.95 in kit form, the Citation II cost roughly 2.5 times what a Dynaco ST70 kit cost the same year. The Fisher 80AZ, a capable assembled stereo amplifier, listed at approximately $189.50. A working session musician in New York in 1960 earned perhaps $175 in a good week. The Citation II was not a purchase made without deliberation. It was a commitment to a standard, to a philosophy, to the proposition that the correct answer was worth paying for. J. Gordon Holt understood that proposition. Holt had founded Stereophile magazine in 1962, producing it initially as a mimeographed newsletter distributed by mail, operating on the thesis that subjective listening, what a trained ear actually heard in a room, was a more reliable guide to audio quality than the measurements that Hi-Fi News and Audio magazine prioritized. The Citation II was among the earliest amplifiers Holt used as a reference standard. His assessment, in the careful language of a man who distrusted superlatives, was that the Citation II did something that most American amplifiers of the period did not. It got out of the way. That phrase, getting out of the way, would become the defining criterion of serious American audio criticism for the next 4 decades. Holt did not invent the concept, but the Citation II gave him a concrete, purchasable American example of what it meant in practice. By 1963, the Citation II had appeared into the equipment directories of High Fidelity magazine for 4 consecutive years. It was stocked by authorized hi-fi dealers in New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, and several dozen smaller American cities. University physics and engineering departments had purchased units for laboratory use, a form of institutional endorsement that no amount of advertising could replicate. The American Audio Society had referenced it in technical discussions. And the audiophile community, still small enough in 1963 to be accurately described as a community rather than a market, had reached something close to consensus. If you wanted to know what an amplifier was supposed to sound like, you listened to the Citation II. If you could build an amplifier that was correct, not fashionable, not affordable, not convenient, but correct, what would you sacrifice to keep it that way? By the early 1960s, the American hi-fi market had developed an internal architecture that most people outside it did not fully understand, and that people inside it rarely discussed openly. At the top sat a small number of products, not brands, products, that functioned as reference points against which everything else was measured. These were not necessarily the best-selling products. They were not always the most expensive. They were the ones that serious people pointed to when they needed to establish what correct sounded like. The Citation II was one of perhaps 4 or 5 American amplifiers that occupied that position in 1962. The others were the Macintosh MC275, the Marantz Model 5, and 1 or 2 Scott designs that had earned their place through consistent engineering rather than marketing. These were not interchangeable. Each represented a distinct philosophy, a different answer to the same set of engineering questions. But they shared a common quality. They had been built by people who cared more about the answer than about the cost of finding it. What separated the Citation II from the others in that group was not its sound alone. It was the completeness of its argument. The Macintosh MC275 used a proprietary output transformer topology, the unity-coupled circuit, that Macintosh had developed in Binghamton, New York, and that produced an unusually flat output impedance across the audio frequency range. It was a brilliant engineering solution to a real problem, and it worked. But it was a solution that required Macintosh's specific transformer, Macintosh's specific circuit geometry, and Macintosh's specific manufacturing discipline. You could not learn from the MC275 in the way you could learn from the Citation II, because the MC275's answer was inseparable from the particular form it took. The Citation II's answer was transferable. The ultralinear topology, the low feedback philosophy, the output transformer specification. These were design principles that could be studied, understood, applied elsewhere, argued with, improved upon. The amplifier was not just a product. It was a position in a technical conversation that American audio engineering had been having since the Hafler-Quiros paper of 1951. And it staked that position with enough specificity that subsequent engineers knew exactly what they were agreeing or disagreeing with. That quality, the quality of being a legible argument rather than a proprietary solution, is why the Citation II ended up in university engineering programs, not because it was the only correct amplifier, because it was the most instructive one. The American hi-fi enthusiast of 1962 who owned a Citation II was a specific type of person. He was, in the majority of cases, a man. The hobby was almost exclusively male in this period, in his late 30s or 40s, working in a technical field, an engineer at a defense contractor, a physicist at a university, a radio technician who had come up through the military and parlayed his training into a civilian career. He read High-Fidelity magazine and Audio magazine and, if he was serious, the early issues of Stereophile, which arrived in a mimeographed envelope and looked nothing like a professional publication, but read like one. He had ordered his Citation II through the Allied Radio Catalog, the thick annual volume that Allied mailed to hundreds of thousands of American households and that served as the primary retail channel for serious electronic components and kits in the years before the internet made comparison shopping a passive activity. The catalog arrived in the autumn. He studied it through the winter. He placed his order in the spring. The box arrived on a Thursday, and he spent the following 3 weekends on it. On a Saturday evening in May 1963, in a living room in a suburb of Long Island or Cleveland or Chicago, a man connected the last lead, checked his work against the schematic for the 3rd time, powered up the Citation II for the first time, and heard something come through his speakers that he had not heard before from any piece of equipment he had owned or auditioned. He did not have the vocabulary to describe it precisely. J. Gordon Holt was still developing that vocabulary. What the man heard was the absence of something, a layer of electronic character that he had accepted, without knowing he was accepting it, from every amplifier he had previously owned. The Citation II had removed it. The music was simply there in the room, without the particular quality of wrongness that he had mistaken for normalcy. He sat in that room for 4 hours. He did not move to adjust the volume. He did not get up for a drink. He listened. That experience, repeated in living rooms across the United States through the early and middle 1960s, was what the Plainview factory had produced. Not a product, a standard of expectation. Once a man had heard what an amplifier was supposed to sound like, the amplifiers he had owned before it became difficult to listen to, and the amplifiers that would come after it, cheaper, solid-state, warrantied, and assembled in Japan, would have to answer to that standard whether or not they acknowledged it. The Long Island factory that built the Citation II was running at a productive pace through this period. The workforce that Nassau County's electronics corridor supplied, precision-trained, disciplined, capable of the hand-winding and point-to-point wiring that the Citation II required, was still intact, still available, still producing at a standard that the design demanded. The Grumman plant in Bethpage was still building aircraft. The defense contractors along the corridor were still operating at post-war expansion levels. The infrastructure that had made the Citation II possible was, in the early 1960s, still present. It would not remain present indefinitely. But in 1963, on a Saturday evening in a suburb that could have been anywhere in the United States where a man with a technical education and a serious interest in recorded music had chosen to live, none of that was visible yet. The amplifier was working. The music was in the room. The factory in Plainview was shipping. J. Gordon Holt had a problem that most audio critics of the early 1960s had chosen to ignore. The problem was this: the best measuring amplifiers did not always sound the best, and the amplifiers that sounded the best did not always measure the best. The American audio press, organized around the assumption that a sufficiently rigorous set of measurements would eventually explain everything a listener heard, had no framework for addressing this discrepancy. The easier response was to dismiss it, to suggest that listeners who reported sonic differences between well-measuring amplifiers were fooling themselves, or listening inaccurately, or simply paying for expensive equipment and constructing a justification after the fact. Holt did not dismiss it. He built a magazine around the refusal to dismiss it. Stereophile launched in 1962 as a mimeographed newsletter, self-produced, distributed by mail to a readership that numbered in the hundreds rather than the thousands. Its founding thesis was direct, subjective listening, conducted carefully and reported honestly, was a legitimate and necessary form of audio criticism that the existing American press was failing to provide. Holt was not anti-measurement. He was anti-measurement as for listening. The distinction mattered, and he spent the better part of 4 decades making it. The Citation II gave Holt a concrete American example of what he was arguing for, what Holt heard in the Citation II, and what he spent the following years trying to articulate in language precise enough to be useful, was not warmth. It was not smoothness. It was not any of the adjectives that audio writing reaches for when it runs out of specificity. It was the absence of a particular kind of wrongness, a circuit that did not impose itself on the signal, an amplifier that got out of the way of the music passing through it and left the listener with something closer to the original event than any comparable American product he had auditioned at the same price point. That description, an amplifier that gets out of the way, was not poetry. It was a technical claim, and it had a technical explanation rooted in the Citation II's specific design choices. The low global negative feedback, the ultra-linear output stage, the custom output transformer, the point-to-point wiring that eliminated the parasitic capacitances introduced by printed circuit boards. Each of those choices had a measurable consequence. The cumulative consequence was an amplifier that measured adequately and sounded exceptional, and that forced anyone who listened to it carefully to confront the gap between those two categories. Holt's use of the Citation II as a reference standard in the early issues of Stereophile gave the amplifier a critical authority that its commercial success alone could not have provided. Stereophile was not, in 1962, an influential publication by any conventional measure. Its circulation was small, its production values were minimal, and its editor was operating entirely outside the advertising relationships that structured the major American hi-fi publications. But its readers were serious, and they trusted it precisely because of its independence from those relationships. A Citation II, recommendation in Stereophile, carried a specific weight, the weight of an assessment made without commercial obligation that a full-page advertisement in high fidelity could not purchase. By 1964, the Citation II had achieved something that most American audio products never achieved: a reputation that preceded it into rooms where it had not yet been heard. A man who had read Holt, or who had spoken to someone who had, arrived at the hi-fi dealer with a specific question already formed. He did not ask what the dealer recommended. He asked to hear the Citation II. Walk into a serious hi-fi shop in an American city in 1964. Not a department store, not a mass-market appliance dealer, but the kind of specialist retailer that occupied a narrow storefront and employed people who could discuss output impedance with a straight face. And the Citation II occupied a specific place in the demonstration room. Not necessarily the most prominent position, the most authoritative one. The salesman did not have to oversell it. He connected it, put on a record, and waited. The record was usually something recorded well: a Rudy Van Gelder jazz session, a Mercury Living Presence classical recording, something that had been captured with microphones and analog tape in a way that rewarded the amplifier's transparency rather than exposing its limitations. The Citation II had no limitations that the music would reveal. That was the point. In the autumn of 1965, a Sony representative walked into a number of those same American hi-fi shops carrying a solid-state integrated amplifier. The Sony TA1120 listed at approximately $200, assembled, warrantied, with a dealer service network behind it. It produced 40 watts per channel from transistors, rather than tubes. It did not require tube replacement. It did not require the 3 weekends on a kitchen table. It did not require anything from its owner except that he connect it and use it. The Sony measured well. It was a serious product from a serious company that had studied American engineering literature carefully and applied what it learned with considerable discipline. It was not the Citation II. It did not sound like the Citation II, but it was $70 cheaper than the Citation II in kit form, fully assembled, and it came with a warranty that Harman Kardon's kit offering could not match. The American hi-fi dealers looked at the Sony. They looked at the Citation II. They understood exactly what they were looking at. Most of them ordered both. A few of them, in cities where the audiophile community was smaller and the mass market larger, quietly reduced their Citation II orders and increased their Sony allocations. Not because the Sony was better, because the Sony was easier to sell, easier to service, easier to explain to a customer who had walked in from the street rather than from a stereophile mailing list. The Citation II had not changed. The room it was sold in had begun to change around it. When the Japanese amplifiers arrived in American stores in the mid-1960s, at a fraction of the price, fully assembled, with a warranty, and without the 3 weekends on the kitchen table, what exactly was the American industry supposed to say? The error that most accounts of Harman Kardon make is to locate the company's decline in the Beatrice Company's acquisition of 1980. The acquisition was real. Its consequences were real. But the Citation II's tube era had ended 6 to 8 years before Beatrice signed the purchase agreement. To blame Beatrice for killing the Citation II is to misread the sequence. And misreading the sequence means missing the actual story, which is more instructive and more American than a simple conglomerate as villain narrative. The Citation II was killed by 3 separate forces, arriving in sequence, each one completing what the previous one had begun. The first force was Japanese. The second was structural. The third wore a suit and had never heard of Plainview, New York. The Japanese force arrived first, and it arrived with a discipline that the American industry had not anticipated and could not immediately answer. Sony, Pioneer, Sansui, Kenwood, and Marantz's Japanese parent. These companies had studied American audio engineering literature with the systematic attention of organizations that understood they were entering a market defined by standards they had not set. They had read to the Hafler-Caros paper, they understood to the Citation II's reputation, and they had concluded correctly that the way to enter the American hi-fi market was not to match the Citation II on its own terms, but to redefine the terms entirely. The solid-state integrated amplifier that Sony brought to American dealers in the mid-1960s did not compete with the Citation II on sonic grounds. It competed on convenience, price, reliability, and the elimination of everything that made the Citation II demanding to own. No tube replacement, no bias adjustment, no 3 weekends of assembly, no $269.95 kit price that assumed the buyer had both the income and the patience to justify it. A Sony TA1120 at approximately $200, assembled and warranted, reached a category of American consumer that the Citation II had never been designed to reach. And that category was considerably larger than the one Harman Kardon had been serving. By 1967, the American hi-fi retail landscape had divided along a line that had not existed 5 years earlier. On one side sat the specialist audiophile dealers, the narrow storefront shops with the demonstration rooms, and the salesmen who could discuss output impedance, who continued to stock tube equipment and continued to find buyers for it among the serious listeners. On the other side sat the expanding mass-market electronics retailers, the chains and catalog houses that had discovered solid state as a proposition they could sell without explanation, without demonstration, and without a customer base that had read stereophile. Harman Kardon was positioned, by its history and its reputation, on the specialist side of that line. The problem was that the specialist side of the line was not growing. The mass market side was. There was a second problem, quieter and more structural, that the solid-state transition exposed without causing. The KT88 output tube, the British-manufactured component at the center of the Citation II's engineering, was produced by GEC and Marconi in England. It was not an American tube. It had never been an American tube. Through the early 1960s, the supply had been reliable and the quality consistent, and Harman Kardon's engineering team had selected it on technical merit without excessive concern for the supply chain implications. By the late 1960s, those implications had become concrete. British tube manufacturing was contracting as the British electronics industry underwent its own restructuring. American distributors of British tubes were managing an increasingly unpredictable supply. A company building a flagship American amplifier around a British component it could not manufacture domestically was building on a dependency it could not control. The Citation II's tube production ended at some point in the early 1970s. The documented range is 1972 to 1974, and the exact final production date is not confirmed in the available record. What is confirmed is that the Citation series continued. Citation 11, Citation 12, Citation 16. Solid-state amplifiers carrying the same name built on transistors rather than tubes, engineered by the same company but to a fundamentally different topology. The name was preserved. The circuit philosophy was not. In a hi-fi shop in Cleveland, Ohio, in the autumn of 1971, a dealer who had sold Citation IIs for 12 years placed his last order for the tube model and his first order for a Japanese solid-state integrated amplifier from a manufacturer he had not stocked the previous year. He had been a serious man about audio equipment. The kind of dealer who could explain the difference between ultra-linear and triode operation to a customer without losing the thread. He still believed the Citation II was the better amplifier. He ordered the Japanese unit because his customers had stopped asking for the Citation II by name and started asking for something their neighbor had. The neighbor had bought a Pioneer. The Cleveland dealer was not wrong. He was responding accurately to the market he actually served rather than the market he wished he served. That accuracy, the American retailer's pragmatic relationship with consumer preference, was one of the mechanisms by which the Citation II's era ended, without anyone making a decision that could be called a mistake. If the name outlives the thing it named, what exactly has survived? The Beatrice Company's acquisition of Harman Kardon in 1980 is the answer to a different question than the one most people ask of it. Beatrice did not kill the Citation II. Beatrice acquired a company whose defining product had already been discontinued for the better part of a decade, whose tube-era engineering culture had already been displaced by the solid-state transition, and whose brand name retained prestige without the manufacturing infrastructure that had originally justified it. What Beatrice killed, or more precisely, what Beatrice allowed to expire through institutional indifference, was the possibility of return. Beatrice Companies was a Chicago-based conglomerate whose holdings in 1980 included Tropicana Orange Juice, Samsonite Luggage, Avis Car Rental, and several dozen other consumer products businesses organized around the logic of brand management rather than engineering excellence. Beatrice had no background in audio equipment. It had no interest in audio equipment. It had an interest in the Harman Kardon name and in the brand equity that Sidney Harman and his engineering team had accumulated over 27 years. And it intended to manage that equity as a consumer brand, rather than develop it as an engineering enterprise. Sidney Harman responded to the Beatrice acquisition by negotiating a management buyback, reacquiring the company within a relatively short period of the initial transaction. The sequence of events between the Beatrice purchase and Harman's reacquisition requires careful treatment. The buyback happened, Harman returned to operational control, and the company continued under his leadership through the 1980s. But the engineering culture of the Citation Tube era, the Plainview workforce, the transformer winders, the point-to-point wiring discipline, the proprietary specifications that had never been published, did not return with him. That culture had dispersed during the solid-state transition of the early 1970s before Beatrice entered the picture. Harman could reacquire the name. He could not reacquire the decade. The Long Island electronics corridor that had supplied Harman Kardon's manufacturing workforce was itself contracting through the 1970s and 1980s. Grumman's defense contracts were cycling down. The component suppliers, the transformer winders, the chassis fabricators, the precision hardware manufacturers that had supported both defense and civilian electronics production were consolidating or closing. The trained workforce that had made the Citation II's hand-wired construction economically feasible was aging out of the trade without a replacement pipeline. Vocational training in precision electronics assembly had contracted as the defense spending patterns that had originally created the demand shifted. The infrastructure that had made the Plainview factory possible was not available to reconstitute, even if the will to reconstitute it had existed. It did not exist. The market had already rendered its verdict. Harman International Industries, the corporate vehicle Sidney Harman used to manage the reacquired company, navigated the 1980s and 1990s as a consumer electronics brand, competing in a market that Japanese manufacturers had largely defined on their own terms. Harman Kardon produced solid-state amplifiers, receivers, and eventually home theater equipment. Some of it was serious work. None of it carried to the engineering authority of the Citation II. Samsung Electronics acquired Harman International in November 2016 for $8 billion. The acquisition made strategic sense. Samsung needed software, connectivity infrastructure, and brand presence in the premium audio and automotive audio markets. Harman International had all three. The Harman Kardon brand and the Citation name within it came along as part of the portfolio. In 2018, Harman, operating as a Samsung subsidiary, introduced a new Citation product line, wireless Bluetooth speakers. a soundbar, a home audio system designed for streaming. The Citation name appeared onto the packaging in the same typeface that had appeared on the 1959 Amplifier's faceplate. The connection between the two products ended there. The last tube amplifier built in Plainview, New York, under the Harman Kardon name had come off the line sometime in the early 1970s. The man who wound its output transformer had retired. The specification he worked from had not been preserved in any published document. The tooling had been repurposed or disposed of in the years that followed. The name survived. The transformer did not. The sound did not. The amplifier did.